Okay, thank you very much. I'd like to start by asking Olga Davka about the role of the NGOs in the context of the Arab-Israeli conflict. What are the challenges that you are facing? Can you tell us a bit about them without going into too many details, please?
Thank you, Khaled, and thanks for having us here. So, NGOs play a crucial role in a democracy. They're associated with such big words: universal freedoms, justice, human rights, fighting poverty. They're so important that according to OECD, between 2010 and 2018, 30 wealthiest states around the world provided $177.5 billion to NGOs globally. EU accounted to almost 10% of that. And in the context of the Arab-Israeli conflict, to your question, Khaled, we estimate that at least $100 million is provided by governments annually to human rights and humanitarian NGOs alone. But while governments and the society by large views these NGOs as authorities on these important issues, as societies, we tend to demand very little to no transparency or accountability from them. And this leaves room for abuse, allowing some and many of these NGOs to become vehicles to promote BDS, anti-Semitism, lawfare against the State of Israel, and in certain cases they have ties to terror. Now let me illustrate that by numbers. Since 2011, the EU alone provided over $42 million to 12 Palestinian PFLP-connected NGOs. This is the same PFLP that the US and the EU designate as a terror organization. In 2019, Israel arrested a 50-people PFLP network responsible, allegedly, for the terror attack which murdered a 19-year-old Grina Schnurr. At least 5 of the employees of these NGOs were amongst those 50. So we provide factual reports on this phenomenon, and we demand more oversight by the governments.
Okay, I think it's clear so far, but I'd like to ask Michal, you know, it seems that a lot of this cuts into very controversial issues. And I want to ask you, where does this criticism of Israel, where does it end with anti-Semitism or criticism of Israel? Can you give us your opinion on that, please?
Sure. Thank you, Khaled. Actually, it's a very important question. I think it's a critical understanding. And lucky for us, we have the IRA definition for anti-Semitism, the result of a 20-year democratic process, a definition that's been adopted by about 30 countries around the world, cities, sports leagues, universities, and so on. And the reason that it's important is that the IRA working definition for anti-Semitism, and I recommend that everybody become familiar with it, not only includes what we know of as the 3 Ds, the demonization, the delegitimization, and the double standards against the State of Israel, of which we can talk about a little bit after how they manifest. In addition to that, it actually very clearly says that criticism of the State of Israel is not at all anti-Semitism, just like the criticism of any other country. So when we regard double standards as the measuring stick, or as the yardstick rather, of understanding what the criticism of the State of Israel looks like differently than the criticism of other countries, then we have this tremendous tool, and that's what it was meant to be. It's a resource. The working definition is a resource which not only has to be adopted, and it has been, as I said, by institutions, including the UN itself, but also has to be implemented. Without implementation, without application, a lot of what Olga spoke about, in a reality where international law and human rights have been weaponized in order to systematically delegitimize, demonize, and single out the State of Israel, not only does the State of Israel suffer, and not only do Jews around the world feel the incredible wave of anti-Semitism, the devastating, rather, wave of anti-Semitism that we have seen, but in fact the entire infrastructure is threatened and collapsing, because at the end of the day that is the rules-based order that we all rely on, and the very institutions that are mandated to uphold, promote, and protect those values are in fact being utilized to systematically, as I said, do exactly what they are meant to uphold, promote, and protect.
So the question is anti-Zionism anti-Semitism also?
Yes, anti-Zionism is anti-Semitism also, because if you define anti-Zionism as the right of the State of Israel to exist as what it was founded to be, i.e. Jewish and democratic, then there is a war that has been waged to delegitimize the State of Israel and the fulfillment of the Zionist dream. And at the end of the day, what we see is actually a huge rift between Jews and non-Jews in Israel and around the world. That's what I mean when I say the weaponization of human rights in that sense. And anti-Zionism becomes a form of anti-Semitism, the likes of which we saw the result of in this last May as Guardian of the Walls was happening in the State of Israel.
Yeah, I'd like to ask Mr. Oren right now. You have a lot of experience with this.
Too much.
On the subject, yeah. Where do we go from here? I mean, and how does the new U.S. administration play into all of this? Can you give us your perspective, please?
Thank you, Khalid. Good afternoon, everybody. We are fighting a fight which, with weapons that are 20, 30, 40 years old. We talk about Hasbara, whatever that means. And the key ammunition in Hasbara were facts. Remember the book, remember the movie, those books, Myths and Facts? Facts don't mean anything anymore. It's not about facts, it's about feelings. And those of you, I don't know, at home in a relationship know that when a fact comes up against a feeling's going to work. A feeling's going to win all the time. During my time as the deputy minister in the Prime Minister's office, I was charged by the Prime Minister with countering the Palestinian narrative, which is very, very simple. It's 5 words. It's oppression, occupation, racism, colonialization, imperialism. Very easy. What are the 5 words that define the Zionist narrative? Go figure that one out. And when you ask someone what's the Zionist narrative, you start talking about 4,000 years of history, and you thought of always having the connection with the world, and our hand is outstretched for peace, and we went through the Holocaust and went through this. You're 5, 6 pages into it. And so we sat down with a group of Madison Avenue advertisers and said, okay, what are the 5 words? And they came back with falafel, cherry tomatoes, beaches, exactly, all right? It ain't gonna work. So I thought, well, okay, we're not gonna make it with the Madison Avenue people, let's go to the poets. And the poets came back with a completely different approach. The approach began with the following line: Israel is home, Israel is family, Israel is community. We didn't get it down to 5 words, we got it down to 5 lines, which was something. But the Holocaust wasn't even mentioned in it. It wasn't even mentioned in it. And I challenge almost anybody in this audience to listen to the 5 lines and not be deeply moved by it. That's the direction we have to go. We have to think outside of the box, always outside of the box. 7 years ago, I wrote an op-ed that said that we should adopt the anti-boycott legislation, which was actually, it was the work of Jimmy Carter, of all people, against the Arab boycott in 1979. Let's adapt it, let's update it to fight BDS. And I published it in Politico, which is a good Washington magazine, and it was picked up by an Illinois congressman named Peter Roskam, for whom there should be a statue somewhere in this city. And Peter initiated legislation in the state of Illinois that made it illegal to boycott the State of Israel. Today, 35 states have adopted legislation. 5 states, including my old state of New Jersey, are now operating and activating that legislation against Ben & Jerry's ice cream. Very effective, but it's not myths and facts. These are out-of-the-box, concrete ways that we can defend ourselves against what is essentially a strategic threat against the existence of this state.
Okay, since law and order are also part of this discussion, I'd like to ask Ruth. You are the head of the caucus for fighting crime in the Arab sector also, right?
Mitigating crime and violence in the Arab sector in Israel, yes.
And promoting the Abraham Accords also at the same time.
I'm guilty as charged, yes.
That's a tough job, but I'd like to hear from you about the efforts to stem crime in the Arab sector. I mean, how do you see it? Are you optimistic about it?
So I'd like to address the audience here today with something that is, I would say it's almost a sore, kind of a wound in Israeli society. For the past 12 years or so, something that has been happening in Arab villages throughout the country has sort of not been taken good care of, if I may say that diplomatically. Now that I'm not a diplomat anymore, but rather a politician, I'll cross the border and try to be a little bit less polite about what a huge threat strategically for the state of Israel, to which I made Aliyah at the age of 17 from South Africa, as you can all hear. It is because we have 21% of the population with hundreds of thousands of illegal weapons running around this country, with issues pertaining not all the Arab population, but some, to poverty, to infrastructural issues, and so on. Separate schooling, originally put in place because of respect for pluralism, and yet it does something about, let's say, preventing a lot of Arab kids from meeting Jewish kids and vice versa, unless this is done in a very unusual way. Because if you grow up in a village and you go to an Arab-speaking school, you don't necessarily meet Hebrew-speaking Jewish kids until quite a while later. And then what happens is, all these factors come together: the illegal weapons, some areas of poverty, a feeling of a little bit more alienation from a mainstream narrative that doesn't come down and is succinct into 5 words. It's not as easy to adopt as the Palestinian narrative or a different narrative. And you have a kind of an easy victimization of young people from the age of 18, say, or 16, into the world of crime. And I just, with your permission, want to give one example. You know, the country, it's not that it doesn't care. It does. So it put the Arab young men into a national objective of employment opportunities. The problem is that these employment opportunities and the age group begins at 25.
What about all this talk about involving the Shin Bet and the IDF and the war against the
Okay,
crime?
so here we come to where is the border and how much do we need to do in order to mitigate this crime and yet respect human rights. So I'm of the opinion that the crime is so very bad. We are over 100 people dead, and we are not even at the end of the year, that we need to do drastic things to make this go away. We even had all the mayors of the Arab towns and cities call for unusual steps. And unusual steps are, on the one hand, not necessarily hurting human rights, but not doing the same thing and expecting different results.
Okay, thank you. I'd like to hear Michal's opinion about this issue. Then we'll go to
Thank you. So actually, the name of our panel, Law and Order, Human Rights, Money, and the Battle for Legitimacy. It's very important that we understand, and just to piggyback off what Michael said before, this war, and it is a battle for legitimacy, it is a war that has been waging. We just marked 20 years to Durban 1, the opening shot of a systematic implementation of a strategy to delegitimize the state of Israel. It has badly affected that discussion that you've just had with Ruth. In fact, the use of human rights has stripped Arab Israeli citizens of agency to such a degree that we've conflated the ability to assist using the language of rights. And at the end of the day, just to continue what Michael was saying, in fact, the war that's being fought has used the language of rights, the lingua franca, spoken around the world. It has taken the law, and therefore, in order to fight back in this war, we have to not only speak the language of rights and affirm international law, but utilize it in order to be able to win back or to fight back or to even have a standing chance. Because in fact, what we've seen is 20 years of a war fought in absentia, where Israel apartheid weeks took place on campuses out of Israel, but affect the discourse inside Israel, with Israel's Arab demography, very deeply driving a wedge through not only internally Arabs and Jews, but also driving a wedge between us and our sisters and brothers in diaspora, and of course, driving a wedge between the State of Israel and her peers around the world, fellow countries. And so in that sense, the tools of the trade, or the weapons we have to fight back with, are the tools of law. And I'll tell you, just for one last thing, that as in the last Knesset, as the first-time appointee to the issue, as the liaison of the Knesset to the issue of the International Criminal Court, first time, and I remind us all that the decision was rendered while I was in Knesset. It is way delayed, and we have to catch up and fight this battle using the right tools, i.e. legal tools, identifying the undermining or the weaponization of law to undermine the ability of all of us to advance the real human rights of all of Israel's citizens and beyond.
Thank you. Well, we heard about fighting. So, Olga, what can be done? How do we fight this?
So I think everything that was said here sort of summarizes it, and we no longer can distinguish between the grassroots and what is happening in villages and cities and what the media is talking about. And we have NGOs pushing for this big agenda that Israel is an apartheid. ICC just started a case against Israel for alleged war crimes. UN sees dozens of resolutions and reports, and NGOs are behind this. So we need to ask for more transparency and accountability. Our reports have led, since our creation, for cuts in funding of $72 million in the past 10 years. In this year alone, the EU, the Netherlands, and Belgium opened investigations over diversion of public funds. This is what it is, taxpayers' money to terror through NGOs. And we need former and current sitting elected officials, both in Israel and outside of Israel, to engage in a discussion, in an interparliamentary dialogue, to draw red lines and to say, we do want a thriving, vibrant civil society, but not at the expense of promoting hate, anti-Semitism, isolation, and double standards against the State of Israel as the pretext of promoting human rights.
Thank you. I'm being told that we're running out of time. I don't know. Would you like to probably mention one more very briefly? You and then Michael, and then that's it.
I want to say one thing about what you just said, Olga, regarding my position as chairman of the pro-Abraham Accords caucus. In fact, I take your suggestion, and I think that we need to reach out and recruit our partners and counterparts in the parliaments in Bahrain, in the UAE, in other places, in Morocco, for example, and to really promote a declaration and perhaps even a cross-border legislation regarding the issue of hate speech, what can be done, what cannot be done, and how it is conducive to making civil society an internal atmosphere better for all the citizens.
I'd like to give Michael the final word.
Final
just
word.
to tell us,
The answer,
are you satisfied with the way the new U.S. administration is dealing with the Abraham Accords?
I'm encouraged now.
Now.
There was some resistance at first, and I think it's going to be, it has been better. Secretary of State Blinken has come out and embraced, of course, actually using the term Abraham Accords, thank you, which has been very good. And now, the proof is whether the administration will actively seek to enlist additional countries in the region into the Abraham Accords. Just a final word on everything that's been said here.
It has to be final because we're running out of time.
And that is, it all begins with us. Whether we internalize that the major battle is not in Gaza, it's not even in Lebanon. The major battle is on the television screen, the major battle is on your computer screen, and that this country and the society begins to invest the sufficient resources, sufficient manpower and womanpower to fight it. And it's not just about buying F-35s and whatever tank we're developing right now. It begins with this. We have to internalize this is the ultimate strategic threat. They're trying to deny us not just the right to defend ourselves, but the right to actually exist.
Thank you. Thank you very much to all our panelists. Thank you very much.